Okay, so this is section 2 of Queers on Screen, a brief cultural history. So we were here with Anders Aldi Andern. Sorry, my German isn't very good. The first pro-gay feature film in the world. And then, while this sort of political activism film was happening in Germany, meanwhile in France, they were making porn. So this is a film called Les Ménages Modernes de Madame Butterfly, which was filmed in 1920. 1920, so this is 2020. It is the centennial of gay porn. Gay porn got invented this year, 100 years. I mean, we know they've found ways to do that. We've found ways to do that before video. But so 100 years ago, this film was produced. It was one of the first films to show graphic homosexual, bisexual, and group sex. It's an example of what is called a stag film, basically short, anonymous, silent films with graphic sexual content that were never shown in big cinemas, but were shown in all-male fraternities, in club settings, and also in waiting rooms at brothels. So this porn film is a great example of the intercultural nature of queer films. It was made in France by a Romanian Jewish immigrant, borrowing plot from an Italian opera that was set in Japan and based in a sort of Japan art form, so a Japanese art form. So this is the sort of intercultural nature of queer cinema in one short porn that I've unfortunately never gotten my hands on. If anyone sees this one, please let me know. So one of the ongoing questions we're going to be asking is, what can a film do, and particularly what can queer film do? But until this time, film had sort of existed in a kind of outside of a whole lot of categorization about what it was necessarily called. But right now is about the rise of sort of different kinds of genres as they are being named. So I want to talk a little bit about the rise of the genre that is now known as the sort of documentary. So there's this guy you should know about. He is not on our queer syllabus, but he's an important guy in the field named Robert Flaherty, and he did these feature-length documentaries, the most famous one being this one called Nanook of the North. Basically, Robert Flaherty was an explorer, this thing that you could be in the 18th and 19th century. He was hired in 1910 to do railroad prospecting in Canada east of the Hudson Bay, which brought him into contact with Inuit people there, who he started filming with a camera that he had in 1915. After losing his first set of camera reels to fire, he returned later in 1920 to reshoot, this time sort of bringing in some more techniques of film drama unfolding in the industry. So the film became this film, Nanook of the North, and the story on this film, the tea on this film here, y'all, is that it was basically totally constructed with this fantasy kind of representational style, though it was pretending to be very honest and true. So Nanook wasn't even this person's name. The person playing Nanook's wife was in fact the director's own concubine. Basically the film participated in every racist trope of a kind of romanticization and disappearance of indigeneity and indigenous people. So representing them as part of the past, the distant past, and not in the present, as always tragic rather than sort of resilient or even actively resisting colonization. So he did this in literally some of his dramaturgical techniques in filmmaking by requiring them to use a traditional harpoon instead of guns, or requiring them to wear formal regalia instead of the contemporary clothing that they wore in 1910. So basically his sexual and relational and, artist ethics were super suspect. And he definitely didn't share any of the money that he made off this film, which was quite popular with any of the Inuit people. His second silent documentary was this film Moana, the first Moana, which was filmed in Samoa and was, we think, the first time anything was called a documentary. This was in 1926. So a reminder that the German documentary we talked about last class was sort of recut and edited into a documentary version of it in 1927. So once again, queer people and documentaries about queer people and global documentaries about queer people have been around as long as documentaries as a form have been around. And I just want to say that while European descended folks like Robert Flaherty were running around the world pointing their camera at indigenous and melanated folks around the world, let's not forget that queer people of color were also busy making their own damn art. So we're going to take a moment to step off the screen and go into live performance and talk a little bit about what was going on in Harlem. So meanwhile, while Flaherty's out there doing these kind of terrible documentaries and thinking he's very important with his new invention, the video camera, the drag ball culture is starting to unfold up in Harlem. Now, our history on the kind of origins and kind of development of drag ball culture has still not been researched super well, because for such a long time it was so heavily stigmatized. I even think this picture on the left is not as early as the 1920s that we're talking about here, but we do have an amazing in-person description by significant Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes. So, who himself was a queer artist. So Langston Hughes describes these balls that were happening as follows. It is the ball where men dress as women and women dress as men. During the height of the new Negro era and the tourist invasion of Harlem, it was fashionable for the intelligentsia and social leaders of both Harlem and the downtown area to occupy boxes at this ball and look down from above at the queerly assorted throng on the dancing floor. Males in flowing gowns and feathered headdresses, like the ones we see in that picture, and females in tuxedos and box-back suits. And that's from his 1920 book, Spectacles of Color. So Dragon Ball culture was emerging, and already it was influencing society, right? All these society people of, a variety of races would go up and see what was happening. As all New Yorkers know, what happens in Harlem, what happens on the edges of the town in immigrant and other marginalized communities quickly get borrowed and capitalized on by the downtown high society people. So we saw that happen too, and soon drag came to Broadway. I'm going to talk just a little bit about Broadway in the 1920s. Broadway in the 1920s was getting kind of queer, y'all. There was this beautiful play featuring lesbian love called The God of Vengeance in 1923 that was originally in Yiddish and actually toured the world, once again, very global queer, before being translated to English and premiering in the US. And then in 1926, there was a hit French import called The Captive, which was a kind of classic lesbian love story cliche written by a straight man. And then in 1927, that play, The Captive, and another play written by famous sort of femme fatale Mae West, who was a writer and a performer and just a glamorous lady. The Captive and her play, which is called Sex, about a prostitute, they were both raided by the Vice Squad, and all the actors in the play were arrested and jailed. So here's the news of the day: sex plays raided, and that's them in the courtroom. Mae West is there in the center, looking deeply into the eyes of those who have who brought her downtown to court. So basically, instead of being put in her place about this whole thing, Mae West upped the ante and wrote a new play that both mocked some of the cheesy writing in the French lesbian drama and also focused on gay men and the emerging ball scene. So she wrote this really cool play that's called The Drag. She had great casting politics. She auditioned and cast exclusively gay actors from a Greenwich Village club. So she kind of devised the piece with them, and they helped her write a lot of the lines. And then there was a sort of drag ball as part of the denouement of the play. So it was a kind of a play within a play, drag show within a play. It made a ton of money, but closed after 2 weeks. And then just a few days after it closed, the New York State Legislature passed this act called the Wales Padlock Act, which prohibited plays, quote, depicting or dealing with the subject of sex degeneracy or sex perversion. And what they mean is like sex work and queer people. So those were the things they had been targeting specifically. And the provision was that everyone involved could be arrested, and the theaters that produce these plays could be padlocked. That's why it's the Wales Padlock Act. For up to a year afterwards. So it made the economic cost of doing sexually explicit work on Broadway too high for any producers to risk, which really brought us back in terms of what representations of sexuality were allowed in our public image, in our public eye. But this had not yet happened for Hollywood. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the road towards the Hayes Act, which was the cinema version of the Wales Padlock Act. So still right now we're in what's called the pre-code era in Hollywood cinema. So this is sometimes thought of as a little bit of a golden age for kind of racy films prior to when the Hayes Code kicked in. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about some of the great films from that era. So one of them is oops, I missed a couple slides, called Wings by William A. Wellman. It was made in 1927. It's a silent film about Air Force pilots in World War I who compete for the affections of a woman before realizing that they in fact love each other. While the relationship is always referred to as friendship, the acting, the directing, the sound design, the cinematography all make it obvious that the men's feelings are romantic. We feel it, we hear it, we sense it. The storyline ends, again, as so many of these early ones do, with death. This is the bury your queers trope over and over again. They kill us off because they don't know how to give us happy endings. Kind of sad. It's happening less now. Anyway, one of these guys is fatally injured. The other one is holding him. There's the picture on the screen. And before he dies, they share a passionate kiss. This was the first gay male kiss in a major feature film. This was with Paramount, right? So despite still the condemnation of gay men in society as a whole, this film was very respectful of the love between these characters, and really humanized them without necessarily exploiting the sort of exoticness of their same-sex love. The director, as far as we know, William Wellman, was not gay, but this was a major moment in cinema when there were, in fact, out gay professionals working in the industry without a whole lot of problem. So John Whale, who was famous for directing Frankenstein, was out, and he was partnered, and he claimed that he'd never faced any prejudice because of it. He was a huge success until he made a slightly too controversial war film, and he basically got canceled. Getting canceled is something that Hollywood has been doing for a long time, and for not always the right reasons. While John Whale's movies didn't contain overtly gay themes, scholars have commented on the queer resonances of humanizing a monstrous creature like Frankenstein through cinema, right? There's a way that we can think about queer people also being humanized through getting to see their journeys on screen. Okay, so that is Frankenstein. Now, next we're going to look at just a little image of Morocco. And this is featuring the amazing Marlene Dietrich looking hella fly in a tuxedo. This film was a major motion picture and had the first sort of brief lesbian kiss in it. The actress Marlene Dietrich is performing on stage, then leans down to one of the people in the audience, kisses her on the face, and then leaves. It's very cinematic and exciting. But that was just a precursor to another film with a larger queer female kiss. This is an excerpt from Queen Christina by a director named Mamoulian, who was actually from the Republic of Georgia. This is another very intercultural example, a global film example. This is a Swedish actress, Greta Garbo, playing a Swedish queen from several centuries before, who was in fact in a relationship with her lady-in-waiting. This film mostly skips over their relationship, unfortunately, focusing on the male partners of the queen, but does have this great female intimacy moment, which I'm going to share.
Ebba, come in.
Now don't dally, Your Majesty. You have a busy day.
Morning, Ebba. What are you doing up so early?
I couldn't sleep.
That means you're either happy or unhappy. Which is it?
Happy.
I'm glad. And what makes you so happy?
Oh, no reason.
How wonderful to be happy for no reason.
Let's go for a sleigh ride.
I can't now.
Oh, why not?
Ambassadors, treaties, councils.
How boring.
But we'll go afterward, Ebba.
Oh, you always say that. But at the end of the day, you're never free to go anywhere. You're surrounded by musty old papers and musty old men, and I can't get near you.
Today, I'll dispose of them by sundown, I promise you. And we'll go away for 2-3 days in the country.
Oh.
Wouldn't you like that?
Oh, I'd love it.
The French ambassador, Monsieur Chanou, is waiting in the council chamber.
There they begin. Countess, you're dismissed. Run along.
Great, so that gave us a taste, but it actually took until the next year in 1931 from Germany to have a film that fully featured and focused on the lesbian experience. So this film was called Mädchen in Uniform, and it was made in Germany by Leontine Sagan, who's the one in the middle there, based on a book and a play written by Christa Winslow, the one on the right, beautiful out lesbian from the Weimar Germany scene, who helped and was involved in the production of the play and then a bit in the movie itself. This is the first genuine kiss on screen between two women who love each other. and made quite a big stir at the time. The film also had great economic ethics. It was the first German film to be collectively produced, and all the participants involved got stock in it. It was influential across the globe. It won awards at the Venice and Tokyo Film Festivals in 1931. Yes, there have been film festivals since a long time ago. And it also inspired 2 other German lesbian films later that year and the next year. Despite, of course, being banned again as the Nazi Party came to power, they banned all the cool films. It was almost prohibited here in the US due to some tightening up of our own standards of what could be seen on screen. But queer cis and general American hero Eleanor Roosevelt intervened herself and helped this film to have a limited release here in 1932 and 1933. So barely snuck in there before this big change that we're going to talk about next, which is called the Hays Code. So let's talk about the Hays Code. Basically, as silent films turned into talkies, the US government was under increased pressure to regulate them. In 1915, the Supreme Court had ruled that films didn't count as free speech, so they weren't protected content-wise. And then in the 1920s, different state legislatures were introducing bills to censor films, like what happened with the Broadway Act in New York City, in order to get rid of the sexual content, especially what was coming in from overseas, right? So in an attempt to avoid state censorship, Hollywood basically agreed that they would regulate themselves, that they would censor themselves, and the government could then just stay out of it. So basically, they worked with Postmaster General Hayes, who regulated what kinds of sensitive materials could be sent through the mail, and at that time seemed like a logical person to help regulate what kinds of sensitive sexual imagery could be seen on screen as well. They worked together to create what was officially called the Motion Picture Production Code, but then unofficially got called the Hays Code. So the sort of big picture of the Hays Code is as follows. The general principles: no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. 2, correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented, whatever that means. 3, law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. Oops. And then there's a couple other sort of specific applications that I'll share with you too in the text itself. It never says anything. It never says the word homosexual, gay, lesbian, nothing. It's all in a very veiled language like this. So no dancing, no nudity. Quote, the sanctity of marriage in the home had to be upheld. Quote, adultery and illicit sex could not be explicit or justified. Quote, portrayals of miscegenation, that made up word to describe relationships between people of different ethnicities or races. Miscegenation was forbidden. Scenes of passions not to be introduced when not essential to the plot. Excessive and lustful kissing was to be avoided. Vulgarity must be subject to the dictates of good taste. Yeah, so basically this code made a lot of movies boring for a long time and sent queer content into the sort of underground subterranean level because it was no longer invited in a kind of more explicit way. It kept queer people out of decades of the golden age of cinema and kept our stories marginalized and associated with crime, right? Because it was a crime it was considered, inappropriate to show these things on screen. So the end of the Hays Code is harder to talk about than the beginning of it, but basically over time, the increased sort of influx of foreign films that were not required to go through this eventually made American film producers worry that they were going to lose out in money. So they allowed some films to start getting a little racier again, and they eventually adapted the Hays Code, which is a strong forbidding, into the MPAA rating scale that we know today. So now it's not that all these things are forbidden, it's that G movies have this, R movies have this, movies that are rated X have this. So we turned a kind of blanket rule into a kind of gradated and complicated system, which still enrolls us in this idea that there are people out there who know what kinds of movies are good for us. Anyway, more on that later. I'm going to end this installment. Thanks.